Hello and welcome to the last chapter of the course. In this chapter, we'll be covering all of White's E3 setups, including D4, D5, E3, D4, D5, NF3, NF6, E3, and D4, D5, C4, E6, NF3, NF6, E3. Basically, we'll be checking all of the E3 systems where White keeps the bishop on C1 and not on F4 or G5, and base and cover all kinds of various move orders and transpositions. The most critical of them is d4 d5 and d4 d5 c4 e6 nf3 nf6 e3, where we transpose to one of the lines in the Manhattan, along with d4 d5 nf3 nf6 e3, which is used by either the Cole or the Zukercott players. Let's first begin with C4. We'll not be covering any main lines in this chapter, but only the systems with NF3 and E3, where the bishop remains on C1. We play E6, and the first move order which we need to check out is knight C3. Against both these knight C3, knight F3 systems, I want to propose a system with knight F6 and A6, where we basically try to play either DC4, and when white takes on C4, we play B5 followed by bishop B7 C5, or we go for the alternate plan with bishop D6 and B6. This makes it easy to be consistent with all the lines, right? And so you have only one system which you need to check out. We play knight F6 as you already know, and the line to check out here is 4E3. So white defends this pawn with the bishop, but restricts the movement of the C1 bishop. It's a possible way to play, but not the most ambitious strategically, as you are shutting down the scope of C1 bishop for no reason. That being said, white players have the privilege of trying something not the best simply because they are white and they have the added advantage of the first move. How do we respond to this? By a typical A6. The idea is that we want to play DC4 and B5, or to play B6, BD6, where we don't need to be bothered about knight B5 since the A6 pawn controls it. We cannot play BD6 without playing A6, since after knight B5, knight D6, white wins the bishop pair. We don't want to give that. After A6, white's best move is knight F3, where white develops their kingside knight and basically looks to finish their development with bishop E2 and short castle. With this, we transpose to the Manhattan system, coming from with knight bd7. So after knight f3, knight bd7, we transpose to the Manhattan system. Let me show you how. So d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, knight bd7. If our opponent plays e3, now we play a6 and we reach the same position via different move order. As usual, our plan is to play b6, bb7, bd6 next. It was possible to play dc4, but if we can transpose to Manhattan, we'll definitely prefer that. After this, white's main setup is to play b3. They don't play bishop e2 because that allows d into c4, bishop into c4, and the typical b5 followed by bb7 and c5. We have seen these ideas multiple times in the QGD setups, where once we get bb7, c5 in, this bishop is very active. The other one, will land on d6, where both the bishops remain active, and we have great control of the center. We might even take on d4 at some point and force white to create an isolated pawn. Therefore, they play b3, and now we play b6 with the idea of putting our bishop on b7 and the other one on d6. White brings out their bishop. White could have started with bishop e2, but after bb7, there is nothing better than putting the bishop onto d3, and after bishop d6, short castle, we'll transpose to our course. bd3, we get our bishop out. White finishes their kingside development and we play bd6. Now white has two ideas. There is bishop b2, whereby white brings out their final minor piece, or there is a4 with the idea of playing a5 and trying to create some weaknesses on the queen side. Let's start by checking this out. This was one of the ideas I prepared as white. It's not something very dangerous, but it's interesting and fresh. White wants to play a5 at the right time and create the weaknesses on queen side. Since if we play ba5, after rook a5, the pawn on a6 is isolated. However, white can't play a5 at this point since a5 runs into bishop b4 and both the knight and the bishop are hanging and the pawn on a5 are hanging. So we can safely castle. We finish our kingside development and now we have two ideas. White has more space in the center which we want to challenge. We can either do it by playing c5 or by playing e5 at the right time. Ideally, we want to play c5, but we have to be aware of a5 ideas. If that is a concern, we'll switch back to the plan with e5. I hope I made it clear that if white has the option of playing a5, we want to play e5. If a5 is not a concern, we'll play c5 and challenge white's center. All right. So after castle, white's main move. After castle, white can play something like bishop b2, where we transpose to a line which we will check now. So bishop b2, castle, and a4. We transpose by a different move order. And if you guys remember, we can't play c5 here due to a5, and thus we prepare e5. Playing it directly would have resulted in being a pawn down after cd5, knight d5, knight d5, bishop d5, and knight into e5. So we prepare e5 by defending it with rook e8, and now we threaten to play e5. White's best bet here is to play a5, which was the logical continuation of a4, and we meet it with e5 with great counter-attacking chances. If white plays d5, we get our knight into the game, and if white takes, that allows us to bring our bishop to the open diagonal, where we are pressurizing not only the h2 pawn, but this knight on c3. We may then play d4 and open up the diagonal for our b7 bishop as well, ensuring that we have great sets of pieces. Instead of that, if white plays cd5, we are very happy to play knight d3, queen d3, and the very cheeky knight into d5, exploiting the fact that after knight d5, bishop d5, we have the pair of bishops, and white can play queen d5 due to the cheap tactic of bishop into h2. And basically, yes, after e5, white doesn't have a great response, and d5, knight e5 allows us to improve our knight and bring it towards the king side. We now have great chances to put pressure on this in this position on white, and I think it's a good moment to stop. Let's go back and check out other 10th move alternatives apart from rook c1, which is the main line here. If white plays queen e2, we remain consistent with our plan and play rook e8, preparing e5. We may also play dc4 to open up our bishop, depending upon what white plays. If white plays queen c2, this weakens the knight on f3, which we exploit by playing dc4. And after bc4, we'll play bishop into f3, g into f3, and c5, followed by putting pressure on the weak pawns on d4 and c4. Due to the weak pawn on f3, we have some chances on the king side as well. Our idea would be to play rook c8, get this rook on the open file, followed by queen e7, queen c7 or queen e7, and getting the rook into the action as well. At the right time, we may strike in the center with cd4 or play knight h5 and get our queen to h4. if white plays rook c1, the main move in this position, we again play rook e8 with the typical idea of playing e5 with dc4 or without dc4. Basically, if we get e5, d5, knight e5 in, our position would be great as all of our pieces would be into action. And that ends up the line with 3 knight c3 and 4 e3. Yes. Now we move on to knight f3, knight f6, e3, where white is delaying the move knight c3. As usual, we play a6, and our idea is that if white plays knight c3, we transpose to the Manhattan and play knight bd7. White has a couple of other tries in this position apart from knight c3, which are b3 and knight bd2. Let's start by checking b3. With b3, white defends the pawn and basically claims that if we take the pawn on c4, white wants to take back with the b pawn and keep some space in the center. We obviously don't want to do that, and thus we immediately challenge white's center with c5. Another drawback of b3 is that it makes some light squares weaker, which we will try to exploit with cd, ed, and bishop b4. White should play bishop b2 here. It's the most natural move and the strongest one as well, where we play c into d4 and meet e into d4 with bishop b4 check. By the way, knight d4 is not great, since after dc4, bishop into c4 and e5, we'll get queen into d1 and white would have to play king d1, which means that white won't be able to castle anymore. So white plays e d4. This keeps more space in the center, but now the bishop is weak and we get our bishop right into the game with bishop b4 check. With bishop b4, we are asking white to make a decision with knight bd2 or knight c3. White's best option is knight bd2, where the d2 knight is well protected and is not as vulnerable as it would have been on c3. If white would have played knight c3, we could have started with queen a5, followed with knight e4, and white is in great trouble. The key tactical point is that rook c1 always runs into queen a2, where the queen is untouchable due to the pen or the a5 e1 diagonal. Therefore, white plays knight bd2, and now it's the best moment to strike for us, as these pawns seem a bit vulnerable, and we play d into c4. White will obviously take back with the pawn, as taking with the bishop is very much inconsistent, and white's minor pieces are not well equipped to play with this isolated pawn. We'll play b5 and play bb7, followed by the typical knight bd7, knight b6, knight d5, and put pressure on this pawn on d4, along with some tactics on this diagonal. If white plays bc4, we finish our kingside development with short castle. White should bring out their last minor piece and play bd3 with the idea of playing short castle next. Now, if white achieves that, white keeps a small advantage due to the extra space in the center. We don't allow that and thus strike in the center with b5. Our idea is simply to undermine white's pawn structure in the center. If given a chance, we'll play bc4 and meet knight c4 with a5, followed by bishop a6, getting this minor piece to an active diagonal and trying to trade pieces. Since white has an isolated pawn, piece trades favor us as the pawn becomes more and more weak, and it's easier to exploit that in an endgame. Plus, we neutralize white's activity. We'll then somehow get a knight to c6 and try to put pressure on this pawn on d4. To give a sample line, let's say white castles, we play bc4, knight c4, and then we play a5 with the idea of playing bishop a6. If white plays something like knight c5, we'll put our bishop on b7 instead, where it is quite active too. Then we'll get our knight to d7, and basically our pieces are as active as white's pieces are, plus white has a poor pawn structure as the pawn on d4 is weak and isolated, so we are somewhat strategically better. It's important to note that here white can't win a pawn with cb5, as after ab5, bishop into b5, we have knight e4, and this knight, along with the king, are in some trouble. If white castles, the troubles are far from over, as after knight into d2, queen a5, or queen g5, win a piece as both d2, b5, as well as the g2 pawn is hanging. We'll win a piece very comfortably. So that's why 5b3 is not that great, and we strike him in the center with c5. White's main move here is knight bd2. White is basically trying to avoid transposition to knight c3 lines, but at the same time, the knight is misplaced on d2. We try to exploit that by the typical c5, trying to undermine white's center, and with the knight being on d2 and not on c3, there is no pressure on our pawn on d5. That's why we go for immediate c5. White's best bet is c into d5, but let's check out the other moves first. If white plays c b3, we transpose to 5b3 with c into d4, ed4, bishop b4, where we are threatening some sort of bishop c3, and thus white needs to play bb2, where we transpose after d into c4. D into c5 here isn't great. White releases the tension early and allows us to bring our bishop in one go, where we have slightly better minor pieces. Our idea is to play dc4 next and meet bishop c4 with b5, followed by bb7 and knight bd7. Therefore, white's best attempt is to play c into d5 and try to force us to play e into d5, after which dc5 allows them to create an isolated pawn in the center. We don't want to do that, and thus we play knight into d5, keeping our structure intact. Our idea is to play knight c6 on the next move. White has two ways to challenge us. One is e4 and the other one is normal development with bishop e2. Let's check out e4 first. It looks ambitious, but white has wasted some time with e3 and then e4. This makes the pawn on d4 weak, and also this bishop on c1 is restricted by the knight on d2, and thus we don't face many problems. We can quietly play knight f6 and attack the d4 pawn. The position is sharp, but we have our chances as well. If white plays dc5 here, we get our bishop out with a tempo, and after e5, knight d5, we have two minor pieces in the center, but white has somewhat more space. White would probably play knight e4, attacking our bishop, which we'll meet with bishop e7. And now this pawn is weak, which we'll try to target with queen c7 or knight c6. If we don't want to do that, we'll play bd7, bishop c6, get the bishop onto this active diagonal, and then get our knight to d7, follow it up with short castle. If white plays bc4 here, we can play b5 and get our bishop to b7 in case the bishop retreats. Let's go back to the 7th move position after knight f6. And if white plays e5 directly here, rather than playing knight d5, we play knight d7 to put pressure on this pawn after these two pair of pawns are traded. We want to play knight c6 and c into d4 next. And that's it for the 7th e4 line. It's not even that popular, so you have nothing to worry about. White probably would play bishop e2 and develop their third minor piece. We meet that with c into d4 and ask white that, hey, do you want to create an isolated pawn or do you want to move your knight to the center? Chances are they'll play knight into d4. e4 creates a weakness, which we'll simply start attacking with knight c6. We'll then play b7 and short castle and follow it up with b5 and bb7. With such poorly placed pieces, having an isolated pawn doesn't make that much sense. Therefore, white players would like to play knight into d4, but after e5, we now have our knight and the pawn in the center, which means we have more space, and white's knight has to retreat, meaning that they lose a tempo, and after knight c6, we are slightly better positioned strategically because of the two knights and the space in the center. we want to develop our pieces and castle next. And if white tries to play knight c4, we may play e4 or f6, trying to retain the center, depending upon when white plays knight c4. That brings us an end to this line with knight f3 and e3. And basically, we have covered all the c4 setups here. We now move on to 2e3, which is not that great, but is used by players looking to play the Stonewall. The Stonewall is a very popular opening at the club level, but objectively speaking, it isn't great. We can meet this with the very comfortable knight f6, and basically white has two ways to fight for the Stonewall. Knight f3 transposes to a line which we'll check now. Let's check out the Stonewall options first. If white plays f4 directly, this is quite premature and this weakens the e4 square, which we'll very happily try to attack with bishop f5. Our idea is to always trade the light square bishops in the QGD structure. And what we want to do here is play e6 on the next move, then get the bishop out to e7, castle, and push c5. To give a sample line, let's say white plays knight f3, we play e6, white plays bd3, we play be7, castle, castle, c3, and c5. We'll then play knight c6 and try to put our knight on e4. We are never bothered about bishop into f5, as after e into f5, we cement the e4 square for our knight and get a great outpost, plus a weakness on e3 to attack to, while white's knight on e5 isn't that secure, because we can always kick it with f7, f6. And that is basically the main setup for us in the Stonewall. If white starts with bishop d3, trying to stop bishop f5, we play c5. We are trying to challenge white's center. White players would play c3, knight f3 is met with knight c6, where white can't play Stonewall, and we'll play bishop g4, putting pressure on this pawn, follow it up with e6. This is not a great position for white to be in, as white would have to spend tempo with bishop e2, which means the positions has gone wrong already. So white plays c3, trying to delay nf3 so that they can play f4. We get our knight out and prepare e5. This is the last chance for white to play f4 and transpose to Stonewall. And now white wants to play knight f3, knight e5, and knight d2. We don't want to allow that, and we play bishop g4 with the point that after knight f3, we now play e6, so that the bishop on c8 is now not restricted. And then we'll play bishop f5 with the ideas which we have already seen earlier. We'll play bishop e7 castle and try to play knight e4. We know that bishop f5 trade is not good for white, as after ef5, this is a great outpost to attack to, and the pawn on e3 is weak. And I think that's good enough for Stonewall. I don't think we need to go very deep here. Let's go back and check out 2 knight f3, knight f6, and 3e3, which is the main line of this chapter. This has been played by both ambitious and club level players. The ambitious player go for the c4 setups, while the club level players go for b3, bb2, knight d3, bd3 setups. They might also go for the Cole or the Zukertort, depending whether they go c4 or not. We still remain consistent with our strategy of trying to fight for initiative, and we play c5, challenging white's center. Now this is a position where white has many options. There is b3, there is the ambitious c4, there is dc5, there is knight bd2, which Ding played in the World Championship match against Nepomniachtchi. There is bishop e2, a favorite of the German prodigy Kamo Vincent. And finally, there is c3, the main line of this chapter. Let's start by checking out b3, the Zukertort system. White wants to play bishop b2, the other bishop comes to d3, knight d2, castle, and c4 in some order. It's it's a good plan, but we want our opponent to get to that stage. We start by playing c into d4 to avoid all those dc5 lines and basically force white to play e into d4. Usually, when we play knight c6 and after bishop b2, if we play cd4, white has the option of playing knight d4. With starting with cd4 avoids that option. The point is, if white plays knight d4, we get e5n, where we have a great spatial advantage in the center. So white needs to play e into d4. Now the problem for white is that this pawn on c2 is very weak, and if we can land a rook on c8, we'll have a great position. Even if this pawn moves to c3, white will have issues defending the pawn, as this pawn is on b3 and not on b2, defending the pawn on c3. We therefore play knight c6, and white has to play bishop b2. If white plays bd3, we have these knight b4 ideas, but before that, we play bishop g4, followed by e6, bd6, and rook c8, just like the Caro-Kann system. But white has committed b3, which means the setup with c3 won't be that effective. So we have a much better version of the exchange Caro-Kann. If white plays bb2, the main move, now I propose playing bishop f5 and not the most popular bishop g4 due to very concrete reasons. The idea is that we are very happy to trade that bishop for the other bishop, not for the knight, and then after bishop d3, queen d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, we just play e6 and follow up with rook c8, bishop e7, castle, and queen b6. The pawn on c2 is very weak, which we'll try to exploit, and basically black stands better in this position due to the bad bishop on b2 and the weak pawn on c2. That brings us to an end with this 4b3 line. An important line to know, in fact, the second most popular move in this position, but I think the solution which I propose is good enough. The most testing line of this chapter is 4c4. This is what the ambitious players of the 3e3 system play. White immediately increases tension in the center and basically says that, hey, let me challenge your center too. After cd4, ed4, white accepts a IQP pawn and claims that after dc4, bishop c4, they have a lead in development. We don't want to allow that and respects white's claim, but we play a very ambitious strategic move as well. So this is for the first time in our course, we are looking to fianchetto our bishop willingly and play g6 just because white has not played knight c3, and thus there is no pressure on the d5 pawn. The bishop is the strongest placed on g7 in this position because the pawn on d4 will be weak, and I don't want to restrict the potential of our bishop with e6. After g6, white's strongest move is knight c3. If white plays c into d5, that just allows us to improve our position with knight d5, where we'll follow up with bishop g7, knight c6, castle, and bishop g4, followed by putting pressure on the pawn on d4. This just gives us a better version of the 6th knight c3 line, which we'll check after checking out 6th c5, where white tries to gain space. It's a good strategy, but not at this particular point because we haven't committed knight c6. We start by playing bishop g7, and after knight c3, we finish our development with castle. We are now threatening to play b6, which is why what white did with c5 isn't great. Alternatively, we might now play knight c6 with the very concrete idea of playing bishop g4 and knight e4, putting pressure on the pawn on d4. So there are two plans we are looking at. One is b6 and trying to exchange the active pawn on c5. If for some reason white plays something like rook b1 to meet b6 with b4, we may then play something like knight c6 followed by bishop g4, knight e4, and putting pressure on d4 pawn. Rook b1 was just an example. It's not the move white is going to play, but I just wanted to highlight the point. That is it for the 6 c5 line, and we move on to the most ambitious, knight c3. Here, we bring out our bishop to bishop g7, and our idea remains the same. We want to play knight c6 castle and dc4. And if white plays c5, we want to put pressure on this pawn via knight e4, opening up the bishop's diagonal, and b6, trying to undermine white's center. White now has 4 critical moves. There is bishop e2, there is bishop g5, one of the most ambitious tries. There is queen b3, and there is cd5, of course. Let's check out the most timid system first, bishop e2. White develops a piece, but now after short castle, we finish our kingside development. And after castle, knight c6, followed by dc4, we have a great position. If white plays c5, we have the natural knight e4, followed by b6, with a great position. We'll have no issues developing our piece. And after cb6, the queen jumps right into the game, maybe first by taking on c3 and then playing queen b6. That means white probably can try 7th bishop g5, which is a very ambitious attempt. White is threatening bishop into f6 as well, and then taking on d5 with the knight. We start by playing bishop e6 and defend our pawn. Generally, we have knight e4 in this position, trying to counter attack and win the knight. It's possible. Yeah, it's possible, but I think playing bishop e6 is a better choice in this position. White has 2 moves here. There is c5 and the main line queen b3. Let's start checking c5 first. White gains space, but after castle, followed by knight e4 or knight c6 b6, we have a great position. The bishop on g5 is misplaced, since after knight e4, we'll win a tempo on the g5 bishop. Therefore, white probably plays queen b3, but now we are better developed and thus right in time to play dc4 and release the tension. If white plays bishop c4, by the way, if queen b7 happens, we'll play knight d7, where we are slightly better due to more space in the center and better piece positioning. We are going to castle or play rook b8 next, followed by knight b6, keeping the pawn on c4 protected, and then occupy this outpost on d5. Our bishop is very well placed here, so the d4 pawn might be in danger. And after dc4, if white plays bishop c4, now we are happy to chop off bishops as we have less space, plus white has a poor pawn structure. And after queen c4, we castle and try to round up this pawn. We'll play knight c6 or rook c8, or knight d7 and rook c8, knight b6, trying to occupy this outpost on d5. I think this is a good moment to stop checking out the concrete lines, and I have discussed the plans here. So let's move on to white's other 7th move alternatives, starting with queen b3. White wants us to play dc4 so that the bishop comes in one move. It's possible to play, but I think the strongest choice here is short castle. We ask that, hey, why don't you take the pawn so that after knight d5, cd5, knight d7, I'll recover the pawn and I have an isolated pawn to attack to. Your bishop, on the other hand, isn't well placed here, and basically we are claiming that we'll end up in the same pawn structure like the dc4 line, but we are a couple of tempos up because we are not allowing bishop c4 in one go, so our piece positioning is better than what we'll have in these dc4 lines, and I think it's a good strategic bet, and therefore we can maybe spend some time analyzing this position. White's best chance is cd5, not to trade the knights, because, well, if you have a poor pawn structure, you want to keep more pieces. We react naturally by playing knight bd7 and getting our knight into the game. Our idea is the straightforward knight b6 followed by knight into d5. White has now 2 critical choices. There is bishop c4 and bishop g5. If white plays the slow bishop e2, we'll play knight b6, and after castle, we'll take on d5, where we remain better due to the poor pawn structure, and this active bishop on g7. Compared to the normal IQP positions, this bishop is far more active and thus gives us more chances than the typical structures with e6 and bishop e7. Let's move to 9th, bishop g5, which is the most played move in the position. White wants to meet knight b6 with bishop into f6 so that we can't take on d5 anymore. And now I'll ask you to think for a moment. Do we take with the e pawn or do we take with the bishop? If you guessed e into f6, that's correct. The idea is that we are keeping the e5 square in control. And secondly, we want with rook bishop into f6, this rook is all not very well placed and we'll have troubles trying to win this pawn. With ef6, we have a very straightforward plan of playing queen d6 and rook d8, and we don't need to be bothered by the knight jumps, and we'll try to win the pawn. Secondly, in some positions, our bishop might actually come to f8, where we try to trade queens with queen b4, and basically if we are able to do that, we'll recover this pawn, and that leaves us with the pair of bishops advantage. White probably should play bishop e2 and try to finish their development. And now we try to exploit the strategy of attacking the piece on b3 square with a5. We are threatening a4, dislodging the queen. Then this pawn would be under pressure. So white probably would play a4. And now we play queen d6, castle, and rook d8. The obvious idea is to take on d5. But if we are not able to do that, we may also play bishop f8, trying to play queen b4 and exchanging that piece so that the d5 pawn is exchanged, or we'll play bd7, rook c8. That brings us an end to this line with bishop g5. Okay, a small point to add here is that for the extra pawn, we have the pair of bishops and the pawns on d5 and d4 are weak. So keep that in mind that as soon as you win a pawn, you'll have a great strategic advantage. And that brings us an end to this line with 9th bishop g5. And we check out white's main and the strongest move, bishop c4. We play knight b6 and we attack the bishop. White castles. And basically white says that please take my bishop so that after queen c4, there isn't enough pressure on the d5 pawn. Now we know that this pawn is the weakness which we want to attack to, and this bishop isn't developed, so we play b6 with the idea of playing bishop b7 and knight d5. White has two critical moves there. There is bishop g5, which is the strongest move, threatening bishop f6, or there is knight e5, which is an ambitious looking move and the most played move, but not the strongest. We just meet this with bishop b7, and our idea is to take on d5. White players usually play knight c6, but after queen d7, the knight is very loose, and we are threatening knight into d5, e6, followed by bishop into c6, where we keep the bishop pair as well as the better pawn structure. Note that we can't play knight into d5, bishop into c6, as white has knight into queen into c6 check first, and after queen c6, knight into e7, followed by knight into c6, where white remains a piece up. If white plays something like rook e1, we'll start by playing rook e8 and then introduce the alternate idea of playing rook a8 and e6. The knight is loose, so our plan revolves around exploiting the tactical motives around the knight and the pawn on d5. That's it for the 95 line. We now move on to 12th bishop g5, which is the strongest move in this position. Nevertheless, we play bishop b7 and try to target this pawn. White plays bishop f6, and as usual, we play e into f6, keeping the e5 pawn in control. Now, it's a good moment to stop, but at the same time, we should try to understand the strategic goals of both the sides. Our idea is generally to play queen d7, rook d8, and rook c8. So we improve and connect the rooks with queen d7, then play rook d8, rook c8, trying to attack this weakness and getting all the rooks into the game. Once we win this, we'll also have the better position due to this bishop against the knight and the weak pawn on d4. We may then try to improve the bishop with bishop h6 or bishop f8. And I guess that sums up the plans of this position. Which brings us an end to this line with c4 and c into d5 along with queen b3. And yeah, I'm sorry. So we checked out queen b3. We have to check 7th c into d5 here. White is basically giving, this is the main move, and white is saying that, hey, please take the knight so that the pawn structure is not disturbed with c d5. But at the same time, the knight on d5 is better placed on f6 since this opens up the diagonal for our bishop. I think, strategically speaking, queen b3 is white's best bet, but c d5 is the most played move. After knight d5, white has two main moves along with bishop b5 check, which is the most natural move in this position. However, we just play knight c6 and we don't even need to check anymore. Our idea is just to play bishop g4 and put pressure on this pawn. We'll castle next. If white plays h3, we can even play bishop f5 and bring out our last piece into the game with rook c8 and castle. But if white takes on c6, we are very happy as white has given up the bishop pair and we have a weakness and so does white, but we have the advantage of bishop pair, so we keep a slightly better position. Therefore, white players also have tried queen b3, but here we spoil white's pawn structure with knight c3. Queen c3 is obviously a mistake since this allows us to play knight c6 and attack the d4 pawn very comfortably, while bc3 creates, knight into c3, bc3 creates a set of weak isolated pawns, which we meet with short castle, and then we'll try to exploit the weaknesses on the c file with knight c6, b6, bb7, knight a5, and rook c8. And yeah, our plan revolves around playing on those light squares. If white plays bishop c4, the main move in the position, we take on c3, and after bc3, we start with the very concrete queen c7 to force this queen on an unfortunate square. Ideally, white wants us to castle so that after bishop b3, they have ideas of getting the bishop out to g5 and putting the queen on a square which they want to. After queen c7 here, they have to choose an uncomfortable square, either d3 or e2 or b3, which have their own issues. b3 is bad as after castle knight c6, we have ideas of a knight fork, while e2 doesn't protect the c3 pawn, and d3 is bad because we can win a tempo with bishop f5. And yeah, that brings us an end to this line with c into d5. And basically, we have covered all of our options after 4c4. We now move on to d into c5, which isn't great, but some players play it. We just play e6 and prepare bishop into c5, where we have more space. White players have tried c4 here, and the main proponent of this has been Hikaru. But after bishop c5, followed by castle and knight c6, we have absolutely no problems in the position. If white plays a3, like Hikaru does, we castle, and after b4, we just play bishop d6 with the idea of undermining the pawns on the queen side with a5, b5, knight d7, followed by b6, bb7, knight c5 in some order. We may also play dc4 at some point if the bishop is on b7 and remains quite active. By the way, after bishop c5, a3 castle, some players have tried cd5, but after ed5, knight c3, knight c6, we are completely fine even though we have the isolated pawn because we have those d4 motifs. After bishop e2, we don't play d4 directly due to knight a4. So we start by a6 and then prepare d4, since knight a4 is comfortably met with bishop a7 and our bishop has a safe spot to go back to. And that brings us an end to the fifth c4 line. And if white tries to be ambitious and play b4, we can play b6, which is not so popular, but has been tried by Levon against Lee Kwang Liam in 3 games. We are basically trying to undermine white's queen side and win the pawn on b4 and basically neutralize these 2 pawns for the b6 pawn. The main move here is c into b6, but bishop b5 check has been tried by some players as well. Let's start by checking out bishop b5, where we just play bishop d7, offer to trade the bishops. After bishop into d7, queen into d7, we are going to take on c5 next and have a very comfortable game. White may try keeping the extra pawn with cb6, but the issue is that after bishop b4, c3, bishop e7, the only move that makes sense is b7, but after queen a7, there are too many weaknesses on the queen side. Our plan would be to castle, bring the rook to c8, bring this knight to either to a6, c5, a4, or d7, b6, c4, and lodge it right into the queen side. Even though white has an extra pawn, this bishop is not going to come out. The knight will be restricted to the defense, and basically we have a much better position compared to the Benko variation. It is quite similar in the 6th cb6 line, where we play bishop b4 check, and after c3, we play bishop e7. ba7, rook a7 gives us the typical compensation after castle, where we play knight a6, knight c5, bishop d7, followed by queen a8, putting pressure on these 3 files. The rook will join in onto c8 or onto b8. Therefore, after bishop e7, white players have tried bishop b5 with the idea that bishop d7 runs into the cheeky b7. We now have to play knight bd7 and white can try to win a pawn with ba7. Bishop c6 was interesting, but after bishop a6, stopping white from castling, we have enough compensation. Bishop a8 runs into queen a8, where we are threatening knight c5, knight d3, and getting the other knight into the game with knight e4. White's pieces are in grave trouble here. In fact, white has to play the very concrete queen a4, ab6, bishop a3 just to maintain the balance, but we can take, and after queen a3, queen b7 getting out of the pin followed by knight c5, the king's in great trouble. Even though we are an exchange down, we are making threats and all of our pieces would join the party after castle rook a8. So I think it's white who needs to be very careful here. Let's go back to 9th move, b into a7, where we play rook a7 and basically we have the typical compensation. You can stop checking, memorizing the lines here, but I just want to show you one of Levon Aronian's games. Our idea is the very simple bishop a6, eliminating this light square weakness bishop so that the pawn square on c4 becomes weak. And after knight d4, we play bishop b7, controlling the knight c6 threat, and follow it up with a short castle next. White played castle in the game, and after castle, a4, defending this weakness, the move which I wanted to highlight is queen a8, opening up the c file for the rook and putting pressure on the pawn on a8. This is a very important motive which you should be aware of. And after knight c5, knight e4, you have great compensation in the position. In fact, you can stop checking out this line out after bishop a3 takes, and e5, gaining space in the center and meeting knight f5 with knight c5 with great compensation. The pawn is weak, you have more space, your pieces are active, everything's going in black's favor. You may decide to play bishop c6 on the next move, and you're not really worried about knight e7 since the rook covers it. That brings us an end to this line with d into c5. We now move on to 4th knight bd2, which was tried by Ding at the World Championship match. White wants to play dc5 and then defend the pawn with knight b3. And just like the main line of this chapter, we play 4 knight bd7 and defend the pawn with our knight so that we can fianchetto our bishop and play g6 bg7. White's main move is b3. c3 has been tried but transposes to the main line of this chapter. And dc5 is not great, as after knight c5 we have recovered the material balance and we keep more space. Computer's top choice is b4, but after knight d7 followed by e5 we have no problems. If white tries playing c4, gaining more space, we play e3 and meet a3 with a5, undermining white's queen side, where we have a very comfortable position. Sorry for that. And yeah, you want to get your bishop out on the next move. If white plays ba5, you play queen into a5, get your queen out, and all you need to do is just develop your pieces next. That brings us back to fifth d3, where white wants to play Zukertort, as we have committed to knight bd7, but we can just play g6. And basically, we are not going into the Zukertort structures with e6, and we are placing our bishop on the active diagonal after bishop g7. Our idea is to play castle b6, bb7, and after that play queen c7, try to get e5 in somehow. White can't play c4 since our bishop is on g7, so there is no real pressure on this diagonal. And this is a complicated position with chances for both the sides, and the better strategical player will go on to win this game. Your idea as a player should be just to put your pieces on best squares. So b6, bb7, castle, queen c7. If you can't push e5, you can play knight e4 and then try to push e5 after getting your rooks to the center with rook f8 and rook a d8. That brings us an end to this 4 knight bd2 system. We now move on to bishop e2, a favorite of German GM Gamer Vincent. White just develops a piece and wants to castle. We bring out our knight 2, and basically we are not bothered by white castling. White castles, and this is the main move, although some people have tried c3 here, including Kamer, whose main weapon is 5c3. However, white wants to play dc5 and b4 on the next move. Therefore, we release the tension with cd4, and after ed4, we reach the exchange Caro structure. As we know, white wants to play bishop f4 in these positions, so we start by playing queen c7, stopping bishop f4, and then we want to play bishop g4, e6, bishop d6, where we have a much better version of the Caro-Kann exchange. We keep all the typical ideas of rook b8, b5, and b4, the minority attack, alive. And basically, we have seen this structure, pawn structure in the London system as well. We have a much better version of the London variations and the exchange Caro variation. Therefore, we go back to move 5, where white plays short castle, which we still meet with bishop g4, and the idea is to play e6 and bishop d6. We don't mind the trade after h3, bishop f3, bishop into f3, as the bishop is misplaced here, and we'll very comfortably play cd, ed, d6 followed by bd6. We'll then castle, play queen c7, and if white plays c3 at any point, we'll start creating weaknesses with b5 and b4. That brings us an end to this line with bishop e2, and now we go on and check white's last side line apart from the main line with c3, bishop b5 check. This has been tried by Anton Guiaro, but it's not threatening at all. We play bd7, and after bd7, we take back with the knight. So this pawn is developed, and then play e6, bd6, castle. We remain better due to the extra space in the center. And thus, we move on to the last line, c3, where white is going for the Kohler system. White wants to play knight bd2 and bishop d3, and might play dc5 in some variations. We don't want our knight to be on c6 here, since white would have bishop b5 ideas, and thus we play knight d7, defending c5 and keeping, and the alternate plan is after b6, bb7, the e4 square, which controls the e2, e3, e4 break, is in control. White's main move is bishop d3. If white plays knight bd2, we play g6, just like the main line, and white has nothing better than playing bd3, transposing to the main line of the chapter. So bd3, we play g6, and we want to get our bishop out to g7, where it is the most actively placed. I'm sorry for that. And where it can assist the e5 break. White plays knight bd2, we play bishop g7, white castles, we castle. Now, strategically speaking, we have more space. Our job is to just finish our development with b6, bb7, and then try to push e5, preferably with the help of rook e8 or queen c7. White's main move here is rook e1, but let's just check a few sidelines. b4 was tried in a few games, where white wants us to take on d4, so that after cd4, they have some space advantage and may gain some space on the queen side. But instead, we gain space with c4, and after bishop c2, we go for the typical rook e8 e5 break, where we stand better due to the extra space. If white plays e4 here, this is a bit premature, and we are better developed to deal with it. We play d4, knight e4, trade our knights, and after bishop e4, we even trade the central pawn. Our point is that if white plays cd4, white has an isolated pawn, and we'll play simply knight f6, bishop d3, b6, where the bishop is on g7, and this bishop will come to b7. Both the bishops remain active, and we have great play against the isolated pawn. If white plays knight d4, now we have the very tactical but very strong e5 gaining space. We'll play knight c5 next. If white goes knight f3, or for knight b5 as well, we'll play knight c5, and we remain better due to more space and the active knight in the center. If white goes knight f3, we play queen c7 followed by knight c5, try to harass the bishop. If the bishop goes back, the other bishop will join in, then the rook joins in. If not, we'll win the bishop pair and remain better due to the pair of bishops and more space in the center. That brings us to the main line with rook e1, where white is preparing the e4 break. We play b6, and we are developing bb7, followed by rook e8 and e5. Therefore, white needs to play e4, the only try, where we take on d4 first. Our idea is that cd4 runs into de4 with an isolated pawn, while knight d4 is met with knight c5, and white loses some material or the pair of bishops. So let's say white plays bc2, we take on e4. If white takes on e4, we take, white takes back, and now we can exploit tactics after knight e4, rook e4, e5, where the queen on d1 is hanging, and thus the knight can't move. If white tries to avoid that by playing queen c2, we can just win the bishop pair and then play bb7, where we stand better due to the pair of bishops. That brings us an end to this chapter. It was the last chapter, and I hope the complete series was fun for you as well as instructive. And I'll see you in the model games chapter next. Thank you for watching.